The heat of the frontier town pressed down like a hammer, dry wind carrying dust that stung the eyes and clung to sweat. Wagons creaked along the main street. Horses stamped and whinnied, and rough men lingered outside the saloon with bottles in their fists. The cowboy rode in slow, his hat pulled low, looking only to buy supplies before heading back to the quiet valley he called home. He thought to keep to himself, but the sound of shouting drew his gaze toward the square. There was a restless energy in the air, a mixture of jeers, whistles, and coin clinking together, the sound of men gathered for something ugly. Against his better judgment, he turned his horse toward the noise. At the center of the crowd stood a wooden platform, and on it, a woman. Her wrists were bound, though the rope looked like it could not hold her spirit, even if it bound her body. She was young, proud, her dark hair gleaming despite the dust, her posture straight and unyielding. An Apache, that much was clear, but unlike any captive he had ever seen, her eyes burned, fierce and unbroken, as they swept across the faces of the men shouting their offers. The auctioneer boomed over the crowd, voice dripping with greed, selling her as if she were a prize horse. Strong, beautiful. She'll fetch double in work or more at your side. The cowboy felt his stomach turn. He had seen cattle traded, had seen men gamble away their wages on dice, but never had he seen something that struck him like this. The woman did not bow her head. She stood like a storm contained, her gaze daring anyone to try to own her. And then, for a fleeting second, her eyes met his. Something in them, anger, fire. A plea that was not quite a plea, rooted him to the spot. The bidding began in earnest. Voices calling out numbers, laughter rising like smoke. The cowboy's jaw tightened. His hand itched toward the pocket where he kept his coins, though his mind screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He owed her nothing. But when another man shouted a price, eyes leering, the cowboy's voice rose above them. Steady, sharp, undeniable. He named a number so high the crowd fell quiet. Heads turned, mutters spread, and the auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. "Sold!" the man barked, slamming his hand against the post. The crowd erupted into whispers, some mocking, some muttering curses at the stranger who had just claimed what no one else could. The cowboy stepped forward, coins heavy in his hand, and the rope binding her wrists was shoved toward him. He took it, looked at it, then let it fall into the dirt without a word. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but he didn't care. He offered her his hand instead, rough and scarred, open not as a master's command, but as a man's choice. She did not take it. She walked past him, head high, her steps measured and silent, as if daring the world to stop her. He followed, the crowd parting before them, the weight of what he had done pressing heavier with each stride. By the time they reached his horse, he knew his life had changed. He had not just bought her freedom, he had bound himself to a fate he could neither foresee nor escape. The ride into the valley, stretched beneath a bleeding sunset, the sky ablaze with red and gold. The cowboy kept his horse steady, his eyes fixed on the trail, though he could feel the weight of the woman riding just behind him. She said nothing, but her silence was not empty, it was sharp, deliberate, a wall as solid as stone. Every so often he glanced back, catching sight of her posture in the saddle, straight-backed and unyielding, her dark eyes always forward. She was no longer bound by rope, but she carried herself like someone who knew chains were more than leather and knots. When the ranch came into view, it seemed smaller than ever. A few weathered fences, a tired barn leaning into the wind, and a cabin built from logs he had cut years ago. It was a lonely place, fit for a man who kept to himself. But seeing it through her eyes, he wondered if it looked more like another kind of cage. He dismounted in silence, leading his horse into the corral, the rhythm of habit grounding him. She followed, sliding from the saddle with the grace of a hawk taking flight. Her gaze swept across the land, pausing on the cabin, the hills beyond, the creek that cut through the valley. If she judged what she saw, she gave no sign. "This is it," he said, his voice rough, as though the words themselves were ashamed. "My home." She met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the horizon. "Your home," she corrected, and the tone carried no softness, He busied himself with chores that didn't need doing, loosening the cinch, checking the trough, patting the flank of his horse. Because facing her eyes felt harder than facing down any man with a gun. By the time he turned, she was already at the porch, standing straight as a spear against the twilight. He walked toward her, hesitated, then opened the cabin door. She entered without waiting, her steps light, silent but full of command. Inside, the room glowed with the last coals of the hearth. The furnishings were simple: a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books and tools, and a rifle resting against the wall. The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. She moved slowly, taking in the space, brushing her fingers over the wood grain of the table, the worn leather of his saddlebag, the folded blanket on the bed. He set bread and water on the table, slid the chair out for her, but she remained standing, arms folded, eyes burning into him. At last she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Why?" He swallowed, the truth scraping in his throat. "Because I couldn't stand there and let them do it. That's all, no other reason." Her stare lingered, searching him for cracks, for lies, until finally she lowered herself into the chair. She broke a piece of bread with deliberate care, chewed slowly, then said in a voice calm as a verdict, "Among my people, when a man buys a woman before the eyes of many, she becomes his wife. There is no other way." The fire popped, and the cowboy sat frozen, the weight of her words settling heavier than any saddle he had ever carried. He had come to rescue, but in one act, he had become bound to her, bound by her law, her people, and perhaps by something greater. He could not yet name. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, painting the cabin in soft gold. The cowboy stirred in his chair, stiff from a night spent half awake by the hearth. He had sat there listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing from the bed, his mind turning in restless circles. He told himself he'd done the right thing, pulling her out of that pit of cruelty, but the weight of what it meant sat heavier with each passing hour. Now, as the morning arrived, there was no escaping the truth that daylight always brought. He rose quietly, adding wood to the fire, the pop and hiss breaking the silence. When he turned, she was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hair falling loose over her shoulders. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, though her eyes followed him with the sharpness of a hawk. He cleared his throat and set about the small routine of making coffee, grounding himself in the comfort of ordinary motions. But ordinary no longer seemed possible. "You should eat," he said, laying bread on the table. His voice sounded thin in the stillness. She rose slowly and crossed the room, each step measured, deliberate. She sat across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady. He tried to look anywhere but at her eyes, the cup in his hands, the steam curling upward, the flames dancing in the hearth. Still her silence pressed against him, demanding. Finally she spoke, her words soft but edged with iron. "You know what you did yesterday," she said, not as a question but as a fact. He met her gaze then, forcing himself not to look away. "I didn't mean to claim you," he said, his throat dry. "I just couldn't watch them treat you like cattle. I only wanted to stop it." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Among my people it cannot be undone. Before all eyes, you stepped forward. You paid the price. You took me from them. That makes me your wife." The words hung heavy in the room, heavier than the silence that followed. He felt his chest tighten, as though a rope had been drawn around him. He thought of his lonely years, of the land he had built with his hands, of the neighbors who already looked at him as an outsider. Now by her law, by her people's eyes, he was tied to this woman who barely knew his name. She tore a piece of bread and ate with calm dignity, as though nothing more needed to be said. But her gaze never softened. She was watching him, measuring him, waiting to see whether he would stand tall under the weight of this bond or crumble beneath it. He drank his coffee in silence, the bitter taste grounding him, yet his thoughts spiraled. He had come to town alone, thinking only of supplies, and now dawn revealed he had woken as a husband. The fire crackled, the sun brightened through the shutters, and he realized life as he had known it was gone forever.